Welcome back to the channel. This is the story of a promise of safety at Fort Lyon and the price paid at Sand Creek. How did this event reshape memory law and the Plains map? If you care about historical justice, please subscribe. November 29th, 1864. Before first light on Big Sandy Creek in Colorado Territory, a column of Colorado volunteers formed on the bluffs above a winter village of Tsistsistas, Cheyenne and Hinonoeino Arapaho families. Lodges stood along the dry channel under low sandbanks and willow thickets. A United States flag and a white cloth were raised over the principal lodge to signal a promised safety while talks continued at Fort Lyon. In that still hour, soldiers under Colonel John Chivington began their descent. The calm question is direct. How did a camp gathered under assurances of protection become the target of a dawn attack, and why did that choice set patterns of war policy and memory across the southern plains? The principal actors are clear. Among the Cheyenne and Arapaho were Black Kettle, White Antelope, and Left Hand, with bands heavy in women, children, and elders. At the post and in the field were Major Scott Anthony and companies of the 1st and 3rd Colorado Cavalry, commanded by Chivington, raised amid a season of raids, fear, and political pressure. Territorial Governor John Evans had framed an emergency policy that pushed friendly people to posts and defined those found elsewhere as enemies. Couriers, interpreters, and traders moved information unevenly between camp and garrison. Telegraph reports from settlements amplified alarms. On the ground, families waited for food issues and further counsel. This episode matters because it reveals how territorial ambition and wartime expediency compressed law and custom until the category of hostile swallowed those gathered for peace. It matters because officers on scene later said so in letters and testimony, shifting public understanding from battle to massacre. It matters because descendants remember at the site today, and because the record once assembled forces a precise accounting of orders, responsibility, and loss. From 1851 to 1864, the ground rules and the ground itself changed faster than councils could keep pace. In 1851, at Fort Laramie, the United States recognized broad hunting territories for Plains nations across the Platte and Arkansas basins, acknowledging movement rather than fenced lines. In 1858, gold on the South Platte drew thousands into the foothills and along the trails to new towns around Denver City. By 1861, a new instrument called the Fort Wise Treaty compressed Tsistsistas, Cheyenne, and Hinonoeino Arapaho land to a narrow tract along the Arkansas. Some headmen signed under pressure of hunger and uncertainty. Other bands denied that the cession bound them. The Buffalo Range already felt the squeeze of wagon roads, mail stations, and new ranches, and by the early 1860s, game thinned near settlements. Agency distributions wavered with transport delays and war priorities to the east. Administration split the problem. Since 1849, Indian Affairs lay in the Interior Department, while troops and posts remained under the War Department. In Colorado Territory, the arrangement produced overlapping authority and wide discretion for territorial leaders during the Civil War. Volunteers guarded stage routes and river crossings as regular Army regiments were sent east. Telegraph lines reduced delay between posts and Denver, but the messages they carried were fragmentary alarms more than measured reports. Newspapers amplified fear and made policy arguments in headlines. Settler councils demanded decisive action. The war year 1864 brought proximate triggers in a tight sequence. In June, a killing near Denver inflamed public opinion and fixed a belief that any Cheyenne presence near settlements meant imminent attack. Through July and August, raids, reprisals, and ambushes mounted along the Platte Road and the Arkansas Corridor. Some were carried out by militant dog soldier circles far from any agency influence. Others were attributed to Cheyenne or Arapaho without proof beyond rumor. In late summer, Territorial Governor John Evans issued proclamations urging those friendly to report to military posts for protection and authorizing action against those found abroad. The language created a harsh filter. On the ground, friendly and hostile now depended on where a lodge stood and who issued the label. At Fort Lyon in early autumn, Major Edward Wynkoop, 1st Colorado Cavalry, tried to de-escalate. He received messages from Black Kettle, who sought a path to peace and safety for families. Wynkoop escorted a Cheyenne and Arapaho delegation to Denver in late September, where civil and military officials heard their case. The talks produced no final treaty, but left an understanding that bands who kept near a post and signaled peace with flags would be protected while terms were considered. In October, command at Fort Lyon changed to Major Scott Anthony, who implemented stricter readings of Denver's orders. He directed Black Kettle's people and associated Arapaho under Left Hand to camp on Big Sandy Creek north of the post. The camp expected rations and continued parley. Objectives and constraints diverged. For Cheyenne and Arapaho, leaders who chose the post path, the aim was survival through winter with minimal bloodshed while protecting women, elders, and children. They needed food issues, ammunition only for hunting, and clear signals to prevent accidental clashes. They faced internal division, since Northern allies prepared for war, and distrusted any move toward Denver, and they faced an external hazard in which any movement away from a post could be read as hostile. Interpreters and traders helped relay intentions, but meaning broke in translation and across command changes. Logistics were narrow, thin herds nearby, short firewood hauls along the dry creek, small caches of powder, and little stock grain. For the volunteer regiments, the objective was to prove effectiveness under expiring enlistments and to break what they defined as enemy capacity before deep winter. The 3rd Colorado Cavalry had been raised for 100 days and was under pressure to deliver a result. The commanders rode into November with mixed carbines and revolvers, a few mountain howitzers, and hard-used horses. Rations and ammunition came forward from Fort Lyon by wagon. Snow flurries and night freezes hardened the surface and quieted streams, enabling long forced marches but increasing the risk of exposure. Couriers fed the column with reports of raids many miles away, often without names or reliable counts. In that atmosphere, a large village away from the post read as opportunity to strike a blow. Policy shifts framed every choice. Emergency proclamations in midsummer moved practical authority toward the military in the territory, even as treaty and annuities obligations remained on interior ledgers. The gap widened. A promise of protection at one command post could be overruled in practice by a field officer who read the same order set as license to attack. The school and agency regime that would later define reservation life was not yet in force in southeastern Colorado, but the logic of confinement had arrived in the instruction to camp within sight of the post or be treated as hostile. By mid-November, winter stress closed like a vice. Food ran short, tempers hardened, and rumors outran couriers. One side waited for issued flour and a hearing. The other sought an enemy to defeat before its term expired. Those converging pressures set the conditions at Sand Creek. Early September 1864. The camps along the Arkansas shifted with the season. Among the Tsistsistas, Cheyenne Black Kettle and White Antelope drew families south toward safer ground near Fort Lyon. Hinonoeino Arapaho, under Left Hand, followed the same logic. Nights cooled. Willows along the dry channel turned dull gold. Couriers rode between lodges and the post with small bundles of tobacco and thin sheets of paper that carried names. The message was simple. Keep near the soldiers, show the flags, wait for a council when Denver was ready. In the settlements, the tone was different. Telegraph keys in Denver clicked out alarms about raids on the Platte Road far to the north. The wires delivered urgency, not detail, and urgency hardened opinion. The gap in meaning widened. September 28th, Major Edward Wynkoop acted on the chance to turn fear into order. He brought Black Kettle, White Antelope, and allied headmen to Denver under escort. The journey itself was a test of signals. At stations along the way, the sight of Cheyenne leaders traveling with a United States officer was meant to broadcast intent. In Denver, the delegation entered offices where territorial and military figures listened in a cramped plane room. The leaders asked for protection for their families and for a clear place to camp while terms were worked out. The officials did not sign a treaty. They gave a path. Camp near Fort Lyon. Display the white flag and the United States flag. Keep away from the roads until the situation cooled. The return to the Arkansas felt like a reprieve. Early October brought a turn that changed how those promises would be read. Command at Fort Lyon passed from Wynkoop to Major Scott Anthony. The weather shifted again, dry wind and harder nights. Anthony conveyed stricter readings of the governor's proclamations and the department's orders. He pointed the Cheyenne and Arapaho toward Big Sandy Creek, a dry reach a day's ride north of the post, and told them to pitch there and await rations and further talk. Interpreters repeated the key lines in tight loops to be sure the meaning held. Flags would mark the principal lodge. Hunting should be close and small. Firewood could be gathered along the bends. The camp took shape in a long curve of lodges, with horses picketed on higher ground, and children ranging for scraps of willow and cottonwood. The second incident unfolded as November opened with scattered snow and a skin of ice in shaded draws. Telegraphs in Denver continued to report raids and stock thefts, many far from the Arkansas and without names attached. Newspapers framed any Cheyenne presence as a threat. The Sand Creek people could not see those lines, but they felt the pressure through the supply chain. Wagons from the post were slow. Flour did not arrive when expected. Hunters ranged a little farther than the interpreters recommended because the nearest game was thin. Each small deviation could read as defiance to a commander who never saw the camp up close. Within the village, the leaders kept the visible signals steady. The United States flag and a white cloth stayed on the lodge pole over Black Kettle's dwelling. Women kept food queues orderly when small issues came. The effect was to hold a fragile peace in place, even as the outer narrative turned darker. Mid-November, a courier reached the post with word that companies from the 3rd Colorado Cavalry were preparing a long march. The regiment's 100 days were almost done. Officers spoke in the mess about proving their worth with a decisive blow. North along the Smoky Hill and the Platte skirmishes with dog soldier circles kept the idea of a broad hostile front alive in their minds. The Sand Creek village became a point on their mental map, not the specific set of families they had never met. At Fort Lyon, arguments surfaced in quiet conversations. Some officers believed the camp at Sand Creek was precisely the sort of place that should be protected, while talks continued. Others accepted the reading that any village away from a stockade was fair to strike. Messages up and down the chain were slow and uneven. Snow squalls erased tracks. A letter sent east might take weeks. A decision made on a cold morning could become irreversible in hours. November 26th, a hard wind swept the bluffs. In the village, women stitched thicker seams on lodge covers and raked ash to find embers. A small party of hunters returned with poor meat and news that mounted men had been seen dust high on the horizon. The interpreter told Black Kettle that such patrols were normal this late in the season, and that the flags meant the camp would not be molested. That night, elders recited the pattern of winters when people held still and let the storms pass. The pattern would not hold. The third incident began late on November 28th when Colonel John Chivington's column reached Fort Lyon after a forced march. The men were hungry, their horses blown their orders in their minds. In the post, some officers refused what they believed was coming. They had seen the camp. They knew its composition. They argued that any strike would be wrong under the guidance given in September and October. One of them, Captain Silas Soule, put his position into words that would be read after blood had been spilled. Silas Soule, letter, Fort Lyon, 1864-12-14. The letter is crisp and measured. It states that he would not lead his men into the village. It notes the flags and the presence of women and children. It names other officers who shared his refusal. It asks his superior Edward Wynkoop to make the account known. Night fell cold on the Arkansas. In the village, no one knew that a debate had unfolded at the post. Families settled around small fires and guarded the few remaining stores of flour. Dogs barked at nothing. The wind ran fingers across the grass. Before dawn, the column moved out from Fort Lyon and turned north. Guides who knew the country took them along the dry channels and low ridges toward the bluffs above Sand Creek. The march erased distance quickly in the brittle air. In the village, a woman stirred ashes and set a pot. A boy carried a bundle of willow twigs to a lodge. The flag still hung. The first hint of danger was the sound of many hooves on frozen ground and the blur of silhouettes on the high bank. In the hours that led to that moment, signals and delays determined what could and could not be undone. The telegraph had carried fear, but not the terms of the post understanding. Couriers who might have warned the village rode with the column instead. Interpreters were asleep beside their families and woke to the same shock as everyone else. The immediate effect of the column's arrival was panic and fragmentary moves to cover escape. A few men seized rifles and tried to form against the south bank. Women grabbed children and ran for the bends. Left-hands Arapaho, who had been told to remain near the post, found themselves swept into the wider motion with no time to present a claim of friendship. The camp built for wintering in place was not built to withstand a mounted descent from three sides. What rose across these incidents was not a single sudden order, but a layered escalation. A promise in late September to protect families near a post became under a new command a directive to camp just far enough away that the field officer who had not made the promise could treat the village as a target. The dry season cut trails and blurred counts in ways that later let numbers float, but it did not blur intent. Each step tightened the frame. Denver's proclamations collected every distant raid into a cloud that shadowed any Cheyenne or Arapaho lodge. The regiment's calendar created urgency where prudence would have required time. On the prairie, the winter light lay flat and unforgiving. By the time the column crested the bluffs above the creek, the path laid in September had been rerouted by politics, rumor, and haste into the path that would end in fire. Before dawn on November 29, 1864, the column that had left Fort Lyon the previous night rode north along low divides and frozen draws toward Big Sandy Creek. The order of battle was simple and local. Colonel John Chivington commanded elements of the 1st Colorado Cavalry and the full 3rd Colorado Cavalry with 2 small mountain howitzers and civilian guides who knew the bends of the creek. Major Scott Anthony, who held the post, rode with the force. Company captains sorted their men in the dim light, some already resolved not to fire into a village they had seen under flags. Horses steamed in the cold. Carbine slings knocked against saddles. The march line slipped down a shallow swale, then rose to the sand bluffs that looked into the long curve of lodges below. The rules of engagement were not printed on a single sheet. They were the sum of months of proclamations and field habit. Territorial orders from the summer had urged those friendly to come to posts and had defined those found away from posts as enemies. The department's situation reports framed striking camps as a way to pacify the plains before winter closed the roads. In practice, that translated to a simple code in the saddle. If a camp stood outside a stockade and near a road, it could be treated as hostile unless a superior said otherwise. No superior stood on the bluff to reframe the code that morning. The village below showed a United States flag and a plain white cloth above the principal lodge. Interpreters and officers who had argued to hold fire were not in charge. First contact was a mounted descent from the south and east. The column broke into wings that sought to envelop the village along the creek bed, pushing fire from three sides so that no easy escape route remained. The howitzers were hauled forward on the firm ground above the lodges. Their first rounds burst low over the flats, scattering stock and people in the open, between the tip of the village and the nearest bend. Men in the camp who could reach rifles ran toward the shallows and scraped at the sandy bank to make quick cover. A few formed thin lines to slow the charge and buy time for families to reach the deeper bends up or down creek. Most people ran. Women lifted children and turned toward the curve where the channel cut a shallow trench. Elderly people tried to follow and fell in the loose sand. The sound was carbine volleys, sporadic return fire, the high calls of people trying to find each other, and the blunt report of the guns. On the ridge and in the swale's company level, decisions produced uneven violence. Some officers signaled their men to hold fire when they saw women and children clustered in the creek bed. Others pressed the charge and fired into groups, moving along the sand. The flags over Black Kettle's lodge were visible early, then lost to smoke and movement as lodges burned. The two howitzers shifted aim and fired across the flats again, striking Lodge Rose and the edge of the channel. In the chaos, some soldiers tried to pull people out. Others pursued those fleeing along the bends. Horses bogged in drifted sand at the foot of the bank, then lunged free into the village where poles and lines tumbled under hoof. The fight lasted hours in scattered spurts as small groups hid in cut banks or brush and were flushed or shot at distance. A short written record from that day and its aftermath shows the divide between order and refusal. Silas Soule, letter, Fort Lyon, 1864-12-14. Weeks later in Washington, the colonel defended his course in plain terms. John M. Chivington, testimony, Washington City, 1865-04-26. The maneuvers after the first descent followed the ground. The creek ran dry in that reach, a broad, shallow channel with soft bottoms and low banks cut by intermittent flows. That meant there was cover, but not much. People who made it to the bends were still exposed to carbine fire from the rim. To the north, the channel curved away into lower country with few trees. To the south, the arc of sand bluffs closed in nearer the lodges. A handful of Cheyenne men rode out to draw fire and were shot from the saddle or forced back. Left hands Arapaho raised signals and were swept by the same movement that struck their neighbors. Some soldiers fired at anything that moved. Others fired only when shot at. The result in human terms was that many of those who fell were women and children trying to reach the bends or cross the flats. Casualty ranges vary in the record. Conservative counts set the dead well over 100 in the village and along the creek. Several witnesses gave higher numbers and described bodies found far from the first lodges, people who had fled and died of wounds or exposure by night. Soldier deaths were few by comparison. The ranges appear in sworn testimony and later tabulations. The low numbers come from quick returns and partial burials. The high numbers come from cumulative sightings on the day and the morning after. Both sets agree that the majority of dead in the village were non-combatants. The humanitarian outcome ran past the last shot. In the afternoon, soldiers burned lodges and destroyed the winter stores. Blankets, tools, and food that would have carried families through the cold were taken or ruined. The wounded who could move crawled into brush or shallow pits and waited for night. The wounded who could not move were at the mercy of those who found them. Contemporary accounts from officers who refused to join the attack describe mutilations on the field. Those details entered depositions and printed reports the following spring. When the column pulled back, people still alive in the bends faced a night of hard wind, no fire, and no food. Some died where they hid. The next day, survivors began a long path east and south, moving camp by camp to find kin and help. Logistics stress pressed both sides. The 3rd Colorado Cavalry had ridden hard for a blow they believed would close their brief term with a result. Horses were blown by midday and needed rest and forage that the frozen ground did not provide. Ammunition belts ran low. The cold took hands off reins and left men clumsy with numb fingers. In the village, food and gear had been concentrated for distribution and then burned. The people who fled did so with what they could carry on their backs. In the sky, pale winter light flattened the ground and erased shadows that might have marked hiding places. By evening, the column had to return toward Fort Lyon for water and shelter. Survivors moved in the opposite direction in small knots. Two disputes recur in later retellings and need concise marking as fact versus folklore. One describes the village at Sand Creek as a consolidated dog soldier force ready for battle. The record of names and eyewitness lists from the post and from traders who knew the bands identify the camp as a mixed Cheyenne and Arapaho wintering place, led by men who had sought talks and had been told to stay near the post. Prime-age fighting men were few at the site, and many were away hunting short distances when the attack began. Another claim says the village never returned a shot. Multiple accounts from both sides describe brief localized resistance by a handful of men covering the flight of families. That resistance did not alter the basic character of the action, which was the descent of mounted troops on a village composed largely of non-combatants. In the days that followed, the confrontation at Sand Creek moved from field to docket. Officers who had ordered their companies to hold fire or who had refused to advance wrote letters and later swore to their statements. Traders with long ties to Cheyenne and Arapaho testified about who was present in the village. Interpreters gave their accounts of the flags and the councils that had directed families to the creek. When the column reached Denver, some newspapers hailed a victory and printed numbers without scrutiny. In the Army's corridors and in the halls of Congress, the contradictory reports forced review. The committee path began with a simple question: what had been struck and under what orders? At Fort Lyon and in Denver, boards of inquiry took depositions. Refusals to fire were named and defended. The colonel presented his view that any Indians on the plains were enemies. Opposing views in uniform said the Sand Creek people had been told to camp where they were and to display the flags. That distinction went to the heart of the law of war, as officers then understood it. By spring in Washington, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War had called witnesses and printed testimony. In those pages, the campaign that began as a march across sand bluffs became a case study in how emergency proclamations, expiring enlistments, and fear could produce an action many contemporaries inside the Army classified as a massacre. On the ground, winter drove the human sequel. Survivors moved in small groups across open country to reach kin and safer camps. Some went south toward the Canadian River. Others moved east along the Arkansas, guided by traders and by memory. Lost lists grew in family accounts. Names such as White Antelope fixed the event in oral record and later in winter counts. In the volunteer camps, men argued over what they had done. A few wrote home and said so plainly. Officers who had refused to participate worried about the safety of their testimony. One of them would be killed in Denver the next spring, a fact that darkened the investigation, with the sense that telling the truth carried local cost. The confrontation at Sand Creek thus contained two campaigns. One was the short, violent descent into a village at daybreak, executed under a field reading of territorial orders that treated any camp away from a post as hostile. The other was the longer movement of paper and sworn words from creek bed to committee room, in which the same army that had provided the men to attack also provided the witnesses who defined what had happened. The first campaign ended when the column turned back toward Fort Lyon with smoke rising behind it. The second campaign ran until testimony and printed reports set the language that historians and the public still use. In both campaigns, the same features recur: compressed timelines, ambiguous instructions, a gap between a promise made at a post and an action taken on the ground, and the human measure of burned lodges, lost names, and a winter night that turned a field into a ledger of the dead. At Sand Creek, the turning point did not arrive with a banner raised or a volley ceased. It arrived in the hours and weeks after November 29, 1864, when the action at Big Sandy Creek shifted from a mounted descent to a documented reckoning. Who stood where and when is direct. Colonel John Chivington led elements of the 1st and the full 3rd Colorado Cavalry onto the bluffs above a Cheyenne and Arapaho winter village at first light. Major Scott Anthony rode from Fort Lyon with the column. In the village, the principal Cheyenne leaders were Black Kettle and White Antelope, with bands heavy in women, children, and elders. The Arapaho under left hand were interspersed among the lodges. The objective for the volunteer command was to strike what they defined as a hostile camp before deep winter and before the 3rd Colorado's 100 days expired. Constraints were real. Ammunition belts were finite. Horses were blown by midday. Rations were thin, and the air was hard cold. The objective for those in the village was survival, under the assurance that flags and proximity to the post meant protection. Their constraints were total. Few prime-age fighters were present. Powder was reserved for hunting. Food stocks and blankets were in the lodges. The weather reduced movement and numbed hands. The immediate effect of the descent was the erasure of any pretense that talk still held. Initiative shifted only briefly and only at the scale of a few men who tried to buy time for families to reach the bends. There was no organized breakout. There was no stand in the sense of matched lines. There was flight and pursuit along a dry channel with low banks and thin cover. When the fire slackened in the afternoon and smoke lifted over burned lodges, the surviving families withdrew into the open country to the east and south. Some toward the Arkansas and some toward the Canadian River, leaving behind bodies that included named headmen. White Antelope fell near the lodges. Left Hand of the Arapaho was killed. Black Kettle survived and would carry the memory into later councils along the Washita. In Cheyenne, winter counts the mark for that year is plain. It is the winter when people were killed while camped for peace. Yet the decisive turn in the larger campaign came when officers in United States uniform admitted in writing that what had been struck was not a concentrated war party, but a village of families told to wait near a post. That admission against interest narrowed the language available to those who wanted the day remembered as battle. One officer put his refusal and his observation into words that could be read by any commander in the department. Silas Soule, letter, Fort Lyon, 1864, 12:14. I would not order my company to fire into that camp. I saw many women and children among the lodges and in the creek. Others did the work. With that sentence and others like it, the field shifted from assertion to record. The constraints that had weighed on the volunteer command became explanations rather than defenses. Ammunition running low and horses spent did not change who lay in the bends. Weather and distance did not change the prior instruction to camp under flags near the post. The effect on the strategic initiative of the Southern Plains was paradoxical. In the short term, Denver printed victory lines and men in camp believed a blow had been landed. In the medium term, testimony by United States officers and civilians who had long lived with Cheyenne and Arapaho redrew the day as a massacre, and that reframing shaped policy resignations and later treaties. The same institution that had produced the column produced the witnesses who named what happened. A brief counterfactual runs close to the sources and to the logic of P2. If the assurances given in late September and early October had been honored in practice with rations issued on schedule, and a visible guard posted between the village and the post, the Sand Creek camp would likely have dispersed into small winter bands before the 3rd Colorado's term ended, removing the column's immediate target. If the column had ridden to the lodges and required an escorted move to the parade ground at Fort Lyon, rather than opening fire from the bluff's casualties would have been minimal, and the investigations that followed would have had no field to examine. Neither alternative requires hindsight beyond what officers at Fort Lyon argued in real time. The human cost anchors the turn. Names fix the ledger. White Antelope's death appears in multiple accounts. Left Hand's attempt to signal friendship ended in the same fire that swept his neighbors. Individual families lost multiple relatives in a single morning, and then in the night that followed, when exposure finished what bullets began. Survivors walked or rode wounded miles to reach kin. Traders along the Arkansas and the Canadian helped some parties move. Agency ledgers in later seasons show the reassembly of bands under stress, far from the creek bed. Ledger artists pictured the attack with the precision of those who knew what each symbol meant. Winter counts across keepers agreed on the motif and the year. In the 20th and 21st centuries, remembrance runs and rides drew a path back to the ground, so that descendants could speak the names where the lodges had stood. Synthesis returns to the structural forces laid out in the buildup. The Fort Wise reduction, the gold rush influx, and the thinning of buffalo near settlements created pressure that made any large village near roads intolerable to settlers. Administrative division between interior and war left space for territorial leaders to issue emergency proclamations, whose practical effect was to collapse the difference between friendly and hostile into a question of latitude and distance from a post. The raising of the 3rd Colorado as 100 days, men built a clock into command thought. The telegraph compressed rumor into orders. All of these forces meant that, when a winter village stood within a day's ride of a post, one officer could point to a promise of protection and another could point to a proclamation defining enemies by location. The turning point thus belongs as much to paper as to ground. It is the moment when written refusals by officers under oath altered the frame from victory to massacre, and by doing so, forced the state and the army to face the consequences of orders issued in a season when policy and fear outran law and custom. In the days after November 29, 1864, the event at Big Sandy Creek moved into law and administration. Boards of inquiry met first at Fort Lyon and then in Denver. Officers who had refused to fire gave statements. Traders and interpreters who knew the bands by name described the village and the flags. Those depositions fed a wider process. In Washington, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War opened hearings called witnesses and printed a long report the following spring. The record is plain. Officers in United States uniform told Congress that a camp directed to stay near the post under flags had been attacked at dawn. That printed testimony became the backbone of later rulings and public understanding. Colorado politics shifted as the record thickened. Territorial Governor John Evans, whose proclamations had framed the emergency posture, that summer offered his resignation as the investigations widened. The colonel who led the column had left volunteer service, and so no court-martial concluded against him. Within the Army, however, the official correspondence and the committee report established that Sand Creek would be treated as a massacre in substance, even when some titles hedge the word. Those are the first administrative consequences traceable on paper in the committee volumes, the Evans correspondence, and the post returns gathered at Fort Lyon. Treaty work followed the lines of loss. In 1865, on the Little Arkansas, the United States signed a treaty with Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders that promised reparations to the families of those harmed at Sand Creek and set terms meant to reduce the chance of another such strike. Names of specific kin appear in the articles. The document is a recognition of harm as well as a policy instrument. The next years pulled against those promises. By 1867 and 1868, war spread across the southern plains, and the Medicine Lodge treaties set new reservation boundaries. By 1869, executive orders located Cheyenne and Arapaho in Indian Territory along the North Canadian. Agency life followed. Darlington and later Concho became the administrative centers. Annuity and ration issues shifted from the Arkansas to the new agency stores. Land and resource control moved with the lines. In Colorado and along the Arkansas, grazing leases and railroad spurs expanded across ground that had held buffalo and village sites. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe advanced west and south, and with it came fencing town plats and the rule that gates and permits governed access. In Indian Territory, the agency brokered grazing leases and later allotment under the Dawes Act. By the early 1890s, the Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation was broken into individual allotments and the surplus opened to settlers. A land run in 1892 brought new towns and new county maps to lands that had been held in common. Water and timber access fell under permit, and fines and jail days enforced the new regime. Each of these steps is visible in printed lease schedules, allotment rolls, and the proclamations that opened the surplus. Demography and health show the human cost after the shooting stopped. Agency censuses in the late 1860s and 1870s traced the reassembly of families who had scattered after Sand Creek. Birth and mortality lists swing with the ration ledger and with disease seasons. Measles and smallpox swept camps in hard winters. Hunger and exposure brought late deaths that the battlefield count did not register. By the 1880s, birth rates recovered in some bands while others continued to lose ground. The numbers are spare lines in agency tables, but the shape is clear. A camp broken in 1864 reappears a decade later on a different river with fewer names. The school and agency regime tightened over the same period. Children were assigned to agency and mission schools near Darlington, then to off-reservation schools such as Carlisle. Language and ceremony were suppressed by rule in classrooms, even as families kept them in homes and at seasonal gatherings. Work details linked rations to labor at the agency and on nearby ranches. In the ledgers, these changes appear as attendance lines, discipline notes, and allotment file notations. In memory, they appear as the years when children were sent far and when words were kept low indoors. Cultural continuance persisted under pressure. Ledger art from Cheyenne historians pictured Sand Creek in strict icon sets that fixed lodges, flags mounted troops, and cut banks in relations that viewers understood without captions. Winter counts marked the year by the fact of people killed while camped for peace. Songs and ceremonies survived in fragments and then in fuller form as community control expanded in the 20th century. Distance did not erase the line back to the creek. In Oklahoma, elders told the story at autumn gatherings. In Colorado and on the plains, the ground itself kept the memory. Runs and rides in late November traced a route from the site to communities on the plains and back again. Each year, names were spoken aloud at the fence line, and family groups tied prayer cloths to the wires. The official memory took shape across several records. The committee report of 1865, printed in Washington, fixed the depositions that officers and civilians had given. The December 1864 letter of Captain Silas Soule to Major Edward Wincoop recorded a refusal to fire, and described women and children in the creek bed. The Little Arkansas Treaty of 1865 listed families to be compensated for losses at Sand Creek. Post returns and board minutes from Fort Lyon and Denver preserved the first administrative steps. In the 20th century, the National Park Service compiled administrative histories that combined these older sources with field surveys and tribal consultation to define the site. These are 5 to 8 core records one can point to in prose. Together, they outline a line of accountability from creek to committee to treaty to site. Present day, continuance is active and public. The autonyms Tsistsistas and Hinonoeino appear in programs and at events. The Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes headquartered at Concho maintain language and cultural programs, youth leadership projects, and memorial events tied to the November date. Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho communities sustain their own ceremonies and memorial work with links to descendants who trace to Southern bands. At the site itself designated as Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, the land is held for education and prayer. Trails are quiet. The interpretive plan centers the words of descendants and the printed records from the 19th century. Each year, runners and riders arrive to mark the day, and school groups stand on the bluffs and look down into the curve of the dry channel where the lodges stood. The place carries both absence and instruction. Across the seasons, the administrative sequel continues to touch land and access. Grazing leases are still negotiated, energy and transmission lines seek rights of way. Archival projects open new boxes and digitize testimony and letters so that younger readers can see the handwriting that once moved through the mailbag at Fort Lyon. Language classes meet after school at community centers in Oklahoma, Wyoming, and Montana. Teachers carry winter count images into classrooms and ask students to read the symbols. Family historians visit the site and add a name to a list that will be read next November. The long arc from P2 to now is consistent. Gold and settlement compressed ranges once recognized by treaty. The division between interior and war created an opening in which emergency proclamations could outrun careful policy. Volunteer enlistment clocks and political incentives favored action before winter. Those structural forces produced the conditions at Sand Creek. The aftermath shows how law and community then worked in opposite directions. Law first recorded what had happened, then tried to repair harm with a treaty, then narrowed movement with reservations, schools, leases, and allotment. Community held names, language, and ceremony through those constraints and then brought them back into public space. The continuance is not an epilogue, but a present tense. Each November, the record is read again. Each year, the site teaches again that policy and fear can be set against testimony, memory, and the will of descendants to keep faith with those who stood under flags at dawn. Across the longer arc of plains, history, 3 conclusions hold. First, Sand Creek was an attack on a largely non-combatant village that had been directed to remain near Fort Lyon under flags while talks continued. Officers in United States service said so in letters and sworn testimony soon after, and Congress published those statements. Second, what followed on the creek bed altered policy and memory. A field action first hailed in Denver as a victory was reclassified in official inquiries as a massacre, prompting resignations and shaping treaty language at Little Arkansas and the later framework at Medicine Lodge. Third, the event accelerated cycles of war on the Southern Plains, helping set the path to campaigns of 1865 through 1868 and to the eventual confinement of Tsistsistas Cheyenne and Hinonoeino Arapaho on reservations far from the Arkansas. Points of dispute remain and are worth stating. The death toll ranges from roughly 100 to near 200 and turns on whether late deaths from wounds and exposure are counted and on which witness sets are preferred. The composition of the village is also argued at the margins. Some later tellings frame Sand Creek as a concentrated dog soldier force. Surviving rosters and trader accounts identify a mixed winter camp with few prime-age fighters present and many women and children. Brief return fire by a handful of men covering flight appears in multiple sources and does not change the character of the attack. Command accountability is debated because the commanding colonel left volunteer service before a court could reach judgment. The governor's intent and the scope of his proclamations are also read differently by historians, though the administrative record shows their practical effect in the territory that season. These disagreements narrow to numbers and emphasis. They do not overturn the central finding set down by contemporaries who saw the field. The enduring legacy works on 3 levels. In doctrine, it reinforced a 19th century lesson about the protection owed to non-combatants and the danger of collapsing friendly and hostile into a map label. In reform, it fed subsequent acknowledgments in treaty text and much later in public history projects that returned decision-making to descendant communities. In symbol, it stands as a case where paper promises failed at ground level, and where testimony by officers and civilians forced the record back toward truth. The site today is held for education and prayer. Annual runs and rides trace a living line between descendants and the creek. School groups read the same names that winter counts and ledger art preserved. The words Tsistsistas and Hinonoeino open programs and close them. Sand Creek endures in memory because it shows with clarity how policy and fear can turn a promised refuge into a killing ground, and how descendants armed with record and ceremony insist that the names of those lost remain present on the land. Sand Creek shows how policy made in offices can fail on the ground, and how communities keep memory alive. The archive and the land now speak together. What would you ask a historian of this period? What should we cover in a future episode? Thank you for watching.